So we just wanted to do a quick check to see if everyone's good on technology. So we're going to say a statement in a minute. And during this training, we're going to use a couple skills that you all can use. So we're going to use thumbs up, thumbs down for if you're relating to something, we give it a thumbs up. If you're not relating or you're not sure, you can give it a thumbs down. And then the other thing is if you really love something we're doing, you can feel free to give us jazz hands, which means you're applauding. And so we're going to test your skills at technology. We all know you've been doing a lot of trainings for a long time. So we're going to test that right now by telling you what I think is a fact, which is that blueberries are terrible. So if you also think that blueberries are terrible, if you could give us a thumbs up. Okay, some thumbs up. If you think that blueberries are delicious, you'll give us a thumbs down. And then real quick to test the chat box, if you could write in the chat box which fruit you think is the most disgusting fruit, that would really help us out.
Watermelon.
Oh, blueberries bananas are gross. You're right.
Grapefruit. Pineapple.
White grapefruit is the worst.
I would say kiwi.
Kiwi is disgusting. Thumbs up, thumbs down isn't really a button. It's literally your thumb. Somebody asked that. You guys are cracking me up. I love it.
I can't spell cantaloupe. Neither can I.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, guys. Okay. So for today, we're going to be talking about domestic violence or intimate partner violence. And we're going to talk in a minute about the language around that. But we're really hoping that today we could talk about some supportive language that you can use when talking to survivors. And then we're going to talk through and identify the types of abuse using a scenario that Raina and I have. And then we really want to talk about some ways to get people to talk to you about their experience and then what to do when they do talk to you about their experience.
So we know that you guys are all professionals and we know that you may have had some training on intimate partner violence or domestic violence. So are you excited to learn about domestic violence? Have you had any trainings on domestic violence? I can't see that slide.
Oh, here.
Have you had a lot of trainings? I can name a few trainings that I had a lot of, like I had a lot of LGBTQ trainings. So did you have many of these trainings or no? Yes, always.
So if you've had none, if you could write a 1 in the chat box.
Yes.
If you've had 1 or 2 trainings, if you've had, could put a 2, a 3 would be a few, you're pretty comfortable, and a 4 would be like too many to count.
So it seems the average about 4, 2, 3, yeah.
Okay, great. So we have a good mix.
Yep. Yep.
That's awesome. Oh, a bunch of 4s. Okay, 4s. Okay.
Okay. So in the work that we do, Patty and I, and I'm assuming you guys too, you guys hear a whole lot of stories of trauma and bad experiences people have had in their lives, and we try to help people work through those things. So one of the things that we have to make sure that we do is practice self-care. Self-care is not optional at all, right? We have to make sure that every day we're taking some time out for ourselves to make sure that we're checking in with ourselves and making sure that we're okay. So one of the things, well, 2 things that Patty likes to do for self-care, she loves to hike, and that's what she's doing in that picture, and she also likes to take runs. What I like to do for self-care, I like to ride my bike. Her name's Naomi. She's cute. She's right there. She's purple. So a few days a week, either Patty's hiking or she's taking a run and I'm taking a ride on my bike. Naomi. As a matter of fact, sometimes I run into Patty while she's running on Kelly Drive. So we just want to make sure that you guys are practicing self-care. Another form of self-care is having good supervision with your supervisor. Not just talking about the cases that you have or the families that you serve, but digging in and talking about how those cases and what those things are, those things that those families are going through, how is that affecting you? So you want to make sure that you have you're having your weekly supervision, talking to your supervisors, filtering through your feelings and filtering through your emotions. Just try to get that connection on to see how this work is affecting you and what are some things that you can do to make sure that you practice self-care. Because in order for us to be great social workers, mental health workers, therapists, we have to take care of ourselves first. So you skipped one. Okay. So during this training, you'll hear us say either domestic violence or intimate partner violence. When we're talking about domestic violence and intimate partner violence, we're talking about the same thing. And I know sometimes when we hear the word domestic violence, we think about maybe violence within a family, within siblings, a brother and a sister maybe having some problems and some issues, or a mother and a child, or a father and a child have some issues and some things that's going on. But for this training, we're talking about intimate partners violence. We're talking about a couple, they don't necessarily have ever had sex or lived together, but if they're partners, them having issues and abuse within their relationship. Also with victim and survivor, sometimes you'll hear us use the word victim, sometimes you'll hear us use the word survivor. For us, we typically try to use survivor because survivor is a more empowering word when we talk about survivors of domestic violence, right? You can be a survivor whether you're in a relationship currently or whether you already left the relationship, right? So what we want to do is we want to make sure we match the language that the client is using. So if the client say, I am a victim of domestic violence, and he or she hasn't been in a relationship for 10 years, we're going to match that language. We're going to say, that they're a victim of domestic violence. If we have a client who says, you know what, he just abused me this morning, but I'm a survivor because I woke up and I lived through that and I'm okay, we're going to mirror that language and call that person a survivor. Then guys, sometimes you will have people who don't identify as either, and that's okay too. We don't want to be the ones that say, no, you are a victim of domestic violence, or no, you are a survivor of domestic violence. We just wanted to mirror whatever language that they use. One of the agencies in the city of Philadelphia that we work extremely close with is Minergy. Now formerly known as Minergy, now the new name is Cordea. Did you know that? Yeah. Okay. They have a new name. So the language that they use when they're serving perpetrators of domestic violence, they'll use partner doing the abuse, right? So we'll say abusive partners or abuser, but Cordea will use partner doing the abuse or abusive partner, right? Or sometimes if the police are called, the police will use, what is the word the police use? Perpetrator of the violence. But it all means the same thing.
Okay, so we're going to talk about what we know about domestic violence. And I know some of you were answering that you were a 3 or a 4 on the training, which is awesome. And it means that you have had these basics of intimate partner violence or domestic violence. If you're looking in the literature or looking on Google Scholar for an article, the language you would use would be, like Raina said, intimate partner violence. In the community that's serving survivors, they tend to use domestic violence. And because Raina and I, we both have about 15 years of experience working directly with domestic violence survivors, it's often the language that we use as well. And when Raina and I do the bulk of our work with child welfare. And so when we're talking to child welfare, one of the first things that we're really working with the caseworker to figure out is this relationship between this couple, and in our case, it's usually parents, is this relationship unhealthy or is it abusive? So here's what we mean. I'm going to tell you a story. I'm going to pretend that you can't see me and you have no idea who I am, because I'll tell you a story about my brother. So my brother was in this really toxic relationship. He and his partner would fight back and forth. They would argue all the time. Whenever they came over for Christmas, we dreaded them coming because any game of categories would turn into a disaster, a fight, especially if there was alcohol involved. You all know these couples. You're friends with these couples. You've seen these people. And the question most people ask to those couples is, why are you all still together? So that's an example of an unhealthy relationship. And here's why. Tom and his ex had equal power in that relationship. They both yelled. They both argued. At no point was either person intimidated by the other person that they couldn't say their piece or say what they felt. They were able to go to therapy together and speak openly about what was happening in their relationship because neither one was afraid about what would happen outside of that therapy room. They weren't afraid about any sort of retribution. Maybe they were afraid of another argument, but they weren't afraid of being hurt and they weren't afraid of saying what was on their mind. When Tom and his ex wanted to end their relationship, they had a huge fight. They fought about money, but they safely ended the relationship. Neither one was threatened, and they were able to go on and live their own separate lives in different relationships, right? So that was an unhealthy relationship that we all agreed on. In an abusive relationship, what we're always looking for is that underlying pattern of power and control. The underlying pattern of, this may be the first time that something physical happened, but underneath that, one person always has more power and control than the other person. And so when we do a visual of it, we say the unhealthy relationship goes back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and argues. And when it's abusive, it looks like this. And so they might be going back and forth, but one person consistently has what we would say is like the upper hand or the control in the relationship. In those types of abusive relationships, most people would not say that couples therapy or couples counseling is a good idea, right? So if we all think about that for a minute, in couples therapy, what would you think would happen in an abusive relationship? I'm going to look in the chat real quick. So if you have a sense of what might happen in an abusive relationship.
Oh, they can't hear us.
You need us to speak up. Sure.
Okay.
Let me see if I can also. Sorry, we're just working on sound. So in an abusive relationship, what would happen if the people went to counseling is that for the most part, someone would not openly speak their mind and say what's happening in their relationship in that counseling session, because they would be afraid of what would happen after that counseling session once they left the session, or they'd be afraid that something would happen 2 days later, or that would somehow there would be a response to what was happened by the person who's in control. Domestic violence is lethal and is also common, and it impacts children. Okay, so I know a lot of you have had experience in domestic violence counseling, so not in counseling, in this type of work, and had some training. So these types of abuse will look familiar to you. We're gonna go over them quickly, and then we're gonna actually ask you to use these types of abuse to think about them with a scenario we're gonna look at. So the 4 types of abuse, when we break it down, are physical, which you've all heard about and seen. It's a stereotypical picture when you think about domestic violence. Emotional verbal abuse are often survivors say that this is the part that hurt them the most, that this is the part that stays with them and that they remember the most. And what Raina and I often talk about is the emotional verbal stuff is different for everyone, because it's the thing that if you push on it is the most hurtful thing for someone. It's the thing that puts people into a place where they really start to doubt their own view of the world and their own sense of their self and their ability to make decisions. Sexual abuse is usually the last thing that people talk to us about. because it's often the thing that feels the most shameful to clients. And that often takes people a real long time and established trust to be able to talk about. And financial abuse is one of the things that we often don't think about, but it's one of the biggest reasons why survivors stay in relationships and return to relationships.
Let's the questions.
That's doing it.
Okay.
So next we're going to go over this scenario. So we're going to give you a couple minutes to read the scenario, and then we're going to read it together. So if you could take about 3 minutes and read over the scenario and specifically what you're looking for. If you have a piece of paper or a napkin, back of a paper plate, to jot down like a couple things that stand out as a type of abuse. And then we're going to come back to that. If you could just take 2 minutes to read it.
Okay, so now we're going to read the scenario. Claudia and Bruce Wallace are both 32 years old. They have been together for 5 years and have 2 children together. There are 3 children in their home: 11-year-old Ryan Duncan, 4-year-old Olympia Wallace, and 4-month-old Zaid Wallace. Their 11-year-old is at camp this summer, and their 4-year-old just recently started back at daycare. When you first talked to Claudia, she let you know that she was really frustrated with her older son. In the spring, he barely logged on his online learning, and his teachers and school counselors ended up reporting Claudia and Bruce to DHS. Olympia recently started back at preschool. When you asked Claudia how she is doing, Claudia said that the preschool said that she has had some accidents in the bathroom recently, but otherwise seems happy to be back at daycare. Claudia said she wants counseling, especially after screening positive for postpartum depression with her physician. She has rescheduled her appointment several times. Claudia doesn't have a cell phone, so it's been difficult to reach her on the home phone. Bruce is a police officer. He works full-time and is the sole provider for the family. When you finally reach Claudia, she says that there's nothing to worry about. She doesn't need counseling anymore, and that she would just try harder. She asks you a lot of questions to make sure that you won't be talking to Bruce about what she says. When you tell her that your conversation is confidential, she lets you know that she's worried because the kids have been eating so much and she is almost out of food.
I think everyone right now who has kids at home can really relate to your kids eating so much. I don't know where my kids are putting the food, but they seem to be eating everything. So right now when we all work with a family, one of the things that we find really helpful is to actually look at things in this way on paper, to think through, and sometimes it's when we're writing our case notes or writing down what happened or preparing for supervision, that sometimes putting stuff on paper can really help us identify, especially if our feeling is, every time I work with this case, it feels overwhelming, but you're not sure why. One of our suggestions, and something that's worked with us as we've worked with survivors, is to put it down on paper in this way, almost as if you're writing a scenario, to help you identify these types of abuse. So, Raina, do you want to tell them the types of abuse you see?
So one type of abuse that we could possibly be going on, we're not sure yet, right? Because we haven't talked to her, is that it could be financial abuse. Did Claudia decide on her own not to work? Did they decide that as a couple, or did Bruce say, you're gonna stay home with the children while I go to work and make the money, right? There could also be some emotional abuse going on and physical, because one red flag that Claudia said towards the end of the scenario is she will try harder. Try harder at what? What is she trying harder for? And who told her that what she's doing isn't good enough? right? So those are just some of the types of abuse that could possibly be. Also, a question that I will ask her, or just think about, is family planning. Did she have a say so or any decision making on the amount of children that they had? Was she allowed to get on birth control and things like that, just to see if there's some sexual abuse going on? Because what we do know is rape is not the only form of sexual abuse.
And the other things that when we look at this case, we really think about, and this is a real case that we borrowed from DHS and switched the names. But the other things that we thought about as potential red flags for domestic violence or for child abuse are that the 4-year-old's having trouble in the bathroom, right? So had some accidents. Could be normal 4-year-old transition, maybe has been away at daycare for 4 months and now is back in daycare. So that could be a normal transition. And I think the other thing that stands out for me about this case is that Claudia doesn't have a cell phone. Mm-hmm. And most of the people we work with, that's now a necessity for most people to have a cell phone. So it's interesting to me that we might assume that they have more of like a stable income, but we have someone who doesn't have the ability to have a cell phone. And also the other thing that makes me think financial abuse is that they're running out of food, mm-hmm. right? So we would assume that they might have more of a stable income given Bruce's job, but they seem to also be struggling financially, which is 100% possible, but it's just something to explore more about.
So in abusive relationships, we see that there's this thing that's on your screen that's called a cycle of violence. Abusive relationships typically don't start out abusive. So if Claudia was walking down the street and she met Bruce, 9 times out of 10, he did not smack her, he did not punch her, he did not disrespect her, he did not call her out of her name. He went in kind of sort of like as a chameleon, right? So he went in to allow her, to let her fall in love with him. There may be some red flags prior to the initial abuse, they indicate domestic violence, but if you don't know what domestic violence is, or if you never experienced it, you won't know what those red flags are, right? So during a course of an abusive relationship, the relationship starts out as what we call apologies and promises. That's where everything is so good, we love each other, we're going to dinner, we're taking the kids to trips, we're going to the beach, we're doing all of these great things. But then that survivor knows that something is going to tick Bruce off. Maybe he got back to work after vacation and his lieutenant is on him about something, or he's frustrated because he's just frustrated, right? So now she's walking on eggshells because she knows that something is about to happen. That's that tension building phase. And then right after the tension building phase, a violent incident occurs. That is, if it's abusive, if it's a physical abusive relationship, that could look like he physically assaults her, he punches her, he pushes her, he slaps her. In more severe cases, he used weapons on her. And then what we find is it goes right back to the apologies and promises. Oh, I'm sorry, I'll never do that again. Some abusive partners don't even apologize. They just may go as regular, normal day. Oh, I'll make you breakfast, or let's go out to breakfast, or let's go to the movies, or let's go do these things, or I brought you a pocketbook, or, you can use my cell phone to call your mom. Because remember, Claudia doesn't have a phone. And then now and again, she's walking on those eggshells. That tension building is building back up, and then it goes right back into the violent incident. And again, that violent incident may be him calling her out of her name, You're an idiot. The kid's school keep calling here because you're not feeding them enough. Or why is she peeing on herself? Or you're dumb, you're a horrible parent. And then that cycle goes over and over and over and over again. That cycle can happen once a day, multiple times a day, once a week, once a month. It does not have a fixed number on how many times in an abusive relationship that this cycle can occur.
And just to add that when we look at this cycle, one of the things that we often see is that people reach out for help or help gets contacted, like sometimes it's not someone reaching out for help, but it's a neighbor calling the police or a school making a report to DHS, often after a violent incident. So it's something for you all to think about as you're working with survivors, that after a violent incident is when you're most likely to be contacted or have some engagement with a survivor. And if you look at the cycle, what comes next is that promises and apologies piece. And this is often why we see people who have been through something awful or something traumatic or something where the police came, and by the time we are involved as professionals, they're already back in promises and apologies. And a lot of survivors talk about that as the hook, right? As the hook, as the thing that keeps them coming back. And I also think it's one of the things that as humans, we want to be optimistic about our relationships, and we want to believe and feel hopeful of that a person can change and our relationship can get better. And so that's also what keeps people in this position and in these relationships of really hopeful for the future.
And sometimes what happens is really quickly, you may talk to a survivor during that violent incident, and then a week later you talk to her again and she's like, oh no, everything is fine, we're great, we're fine. You know, during a violent incident, she may say, I'm ready to leave, give me all the information, I want to go to shelter. And then you go to give her the resources and she's like, nah, we're fine, it's going to be okay. So then you actually watching the cycle of violence going on, and it can be very frustrating. That's why we always want to make sure that we're practicing self-care.
And one thing that Raina and I didn't say in the beginning is that anyone can be a survivor of domestic violence. So men can be survivors, women can be survivors, same-sex relationships, opposite-sex relationships, people who are having sex with their partner, people who aren't, teenagers, people who live together, people who don't, older individuals can be survivors. And we've worked with all of those people who are survivors of DV. And sometimes we use gendered language, but really just wanted to note that really anybody can be a survivor, that there have been studies that looked across incomes, across race, to see that anyone can be a survivor of DV. Okay, so these are some barriers or difficulties or why people stay in abusive relationships, right? They could stay because they're hopeful, right? They're thinking about the apologies and promises part of the cycle of violence, where they're like, oh no, he said this is the last time that he's going to do it. Or, you know, when I first met him, he wasn't this way. So there's a possibility that he is going to change, or that he did change. They stay, like Patty said a little earlier, they stay because financial reasons. It's hard out here. It's hard to live in a home sometimes with 2 incomes. Can you imagine living in a home with 1? Sometimes that can be very difficult, especially she has 3 children. She can stay because of the children. She wants the father of her children to help raise the children. It can also be shameful. Society can be very harsh at times, right? Some people want to push for their marriage to work, and they don't. If they feel like if their marriage don't work, then they're failed, right? So those are some reasons why, you know, people stay. Also, leaving an abusive relationship does not mean that the abuse ends. Actually, leaving a relationship is more dangerous than actually staying in one. And the reason is because once you leave an abusive relationship, you are literally taking your power and control back from the person who has taken your power and control. What better way to say, I want my power and control back than it is by leaving, right? So for survivors of domestic violence, it can be very dangerous for them to leave a relationship, especially within their first 2 months, because they're taking their power and control back. They don't have anywhere to go. There's no shelter space. The housing in Philadelphia is bleak, is expensive. So these are all reasons why survivors stay in abusive relationships. Now, thinking back to the scenario, what are some reasons why you think, some possible reasons why you think Claudia stayed in a relationship with Bruce? If you can use the chat box, we know some of you are having trouble with the chat, but if you can use this chat box, if you can put some of the reasons why you think Claudia might stay in the relationship.
Okay. Patty, can I just intervene for? There's a few of you that are having problems with your chat. if you can't get it to work by clicking on Alt H or going into your account settings, you can go ahead and use the Q&A. Do you see it, Patty, at the bottom?
Yep.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
So if you do have the ability to use the chat box, if you could put in the chat box some of the reasons why, oh, there we go. Yep.
He's a cop, absolutely.
Mhm.
Finances, children, love, exactly. I didn't mention love. One thing in abusive relationships, right? The survivor love her partner or his partner. It's not, you know, they love him. That's a good example of the reason why they stay. She's scared. That is very scary. She doesn't have any employment. He's a cop. She can have lack of fear. I mean, the lack of support. One thing we do know about survivors of domestic violence, they're isolated. They're isolated from their friends and their family. They don't have that many supports because that's a tactic that this abusive partner used in order to gain more power and control over their partner.
Yep. A couple people were writing in about how scary it would be to need to reach out for help and consider calling the police, but your partner is a police officer, and what that response to be. A lot of people are putting
We've seen that a lot.
Mhm.
We've seen that a lot. Codependency is a huge, yes, codependency. And also what typically happens is, and sometimes we don't think about, if you're in an abusive relationship and you've been in that relationship for a while, it becomes your norm. You know, we're all still getting adjusted to COVID-19 and the things that we have to do. Eventually, if this goes on, it probably, now for me, wearing a mask is becoming normal, right? I don't like it really, but it's becoming normal. So it becomes their norm. Staying for the children, absolutely.
And I think sometimes we say like, oh, someone's staying for the children, but for a lot of survivors, it's very important to them that their children grow up with a two-parent household. And that is a real motivator, and it's something we've seen a lot of survivors make decisions that were really hard out of fear for their children. So they left or they went to shelter, and we've seen a lot of people who make decisions for their children to stay because they think that is safer or better for their children.
Absolutely.
Good job, you guys.
Yes, great job.
How scary is that balloon?
And it's cross-sided.
I know what I like it. You want to do it? Go ahead.
Okay. So now that you have this information, how do you get a survivor to talk to you, right? That sometimes is not an easy feat. See, me, I just talk a lot. So if I was a survivor of domestic violence, I would just yap it all out. But some people, because they're isolated and because they're fearful, it's not that easy to get them to talk to you, right? So one thing that we have to think about, we have to understand and try to figure out, where are they at in the stages of change? Are they in pre-contemplation? Are they in action? Are they in maintenance? You have to take in consideration those factors, right? You have to also keep in mind, this is super important, like especially in the work that I've done with domestic violence survivors, I take this extremely serious. You may be the first person that they've ever disclosed that they're being abused. That is a lot, and that is heavy. It's not only, it's a lot for the survivor, and it's definitely a lot for the listener as well. Because we don't know what their experiences have been. We don't know who they've talked to, any help that they've gotten. You know, they could take the children to the doctor and never disclose to their physician that they're being abused. Or they can sustain injuries and never go to the doctor for the injuries, right? So you just want to be extremely mindful that you may be the first person that they've disclosed that what their experiences are. Also, keep in mind the 4 C's, which is you want to create a comfortable, clear space for a non-judgmental conversation. Because if a survivor feel like you're judging them, they're going to shut up. They're just going to stop. If they feel like if they feel like in them sharing with you is too heavy by maybe your facial expression, like if you do it with this balloon doing, like, they're not going to share, right? They're going to be too afraid to share because they don't believe that you can actually handle what they're telling you, right? So you want to make sure that it's comfortable and it's non-judgmental. And you can do that by showing that your body, your rules, your face, and the space that you are actually listening. One thing that I try to do when I'm talking to a survivor is I try to keep my poker face, because we have heard some terrible stories, right? Horrible, scary stories. So I just try to keep my face calm, and every now and again, just, to give them, to affirm them and to help me, I just nod my head. Okay. And now just say, you know what, this is difficult and this is not your fault. There's nothing that you have done to ever deserve this, right? And before you get into that tough conversation, you kind of sort of want to like shoot the breeze. You want to go in and say, how's the weather outside? Because it sure is hot. Because when I got here today, my dress was stuck to my body because that's how bad I was sweating. Right? You want to just shoot the breeze. You don't just want to dig into that heavy stuff. You want to get them a little comfortable, because by the time they talk to you, their fear level, they're here, right? Shooting the breeze first can kind of sort of like bring them down some, and take them off them a drink of water, anything just to bring their nerves down. And one thing that's super important as well is, are you asking that question because you need to know it, or are you being nosy? Right? Because there's times where we've heard stories and we want to get more details of the story, not because it will help us help the survivor, but because we're just so intrigued by the story, we just want to be nosy. So you want to be, because the survivor will pick that up. Like, do she really need to know this? So you really want to be mindful in what you're talking to the survivor about, or what you're asking the survivor. Like, is this you need to know? Or is this, this is Raina just being a little newsy right now. Let me not ask that question, right? Because all of these things will help a survivor open up and feel comfortable to share with you. And also, even if it's the first time a survivor sharing that information with you, she may be sharing it because she's ready to leave. Right? And she may be seeking help from you to help her with a plan, or help her with resources and all of those things. So you don't want to do the opposite of these things to make her say, you know what, there's no help out there. I'm just going to go back to my abusive partner. Mind you, she can make the decision anyway. We just don't want to be a part of having her make that type of decision.
And I really think about how, when all of us have been recently on this really unstable, unsure path right now with coronavirus and everything else that's happening. And one of the things that we think a lot about is how often we, as a community, as a society, have gotten used to saying to someone, "How are you, Raina?"
I'm just fine.
She's just fine, right? And so we're not actually asking people and really sitting down very often to say, "Tell me how you are. How are you doing?" And the example we always give is that my mom is very sick. And if someone asks me on the street, "Hey, Patty, how's your mom?" Right? And if I'm like busy doing something and that person's busy doing something, and maybe we're both masked up and walking past each other and it's 100 million degrees and my dress is stuck to me like Raina's was, I might just answer, "She's fine," right? Or "I'm fine. She's fine. Everything's fine." But if we sit down somewhere and I feel like Raina really wants to hear what I have to say, and she says, "Patty, tell me how your mom's doing," right? I'm going to have it's the same question, but it's a completely different response to her. And even though Raina and I are friends, I always will tell a bit of what's happening. And this is what survivors do too. They tell you a little piece of that iceberg and they say, "She's having a hard time recently." Right? And what survivors do is they do the same thing. "I'm having a bit of a hard time right now." And what they're looking to see is, do you then say, "Okay, well, question number 47 says, where do your children go to school?" Or do you say, "I'm really sorry. Do you have a minute to tell me more about what's happening?" Right? And so if Raina and I, if we're friends, she might just say, "Tell me more," because we already have that trust built between us. But people tell you bits and pieces to see how you react, to tell you if they can really tell you their heart of what's happening, right? You're not gonna start a conversation unless it's a really good friend with, "I need to talk to you right now. This is really urgent and I'm really upset about this." Most people test the waters to see, is this someone who has the ability or capacity to listen to me right now?
Okay. So in thinking about the scenario with Claudia and Bruce, one thing that we look for when we're talking to survivors is something that's called lethality risk factors. in the case, right? So though a lethality risk factor is certain things that's on this list that can happen or occur within a relationship that can lead to murder, right? Whether it's murder of the abusive partner murdering the survivor, or is it murder-suicide. And there's certain things that has to happen or happens in these cases where can definitely lead to murder. And some of those things are access to guns, strangulation. We tend to say choking, right? We tend to say, oh, someone choked me, or they put their hands around my neck or something like that. So we're looking for that. Also, did they violate the PFA? Because one thing violating a PFA tells us is that they have no regard for authority, right? A judge ordered the protection from abuse order, and the abusive partner violates it. He could care less, or she can care less that she has this protection from abuse order. The abusive partner is stalking the survivor once she leaves the relationship. That the violence is escalating. So you'll hear a survivor say, well, when we first got together, he would do stuff like push me around and, just smack me. Now he's throwing me down the stairs, or he's punching me in my ribs, right? And then suicidal ideation. Does the abusive partner talk about suicide? Do he say that he's going to kill himself? Do he say that things like, when me and the kids, we're going to all take a ride, and then I'm just going to crash into a door. Crash into a wall. So those are things that we look for to assess for lethality. So with that being said, what are some lethality risk factors that you see in Claudia and Bruce's case? And you can use the question and answer box for that. So it was, what lethality risk factors are you sure that's present in this case? Absolutely, he has a weapon, he's a cop, he has a gun. That is a definite red flag.
So even though it doesn't say like he has a weapon in the home, as a police officer, we're assuming he has a weapon or access to a weapon.
And also, even if sometimes it's not apparent whether or not, when you say suicidal ideation, do you mean the victim, survivors, or the abusers? The abuser, the abusive partner.
When talking about the suicidal ideation.
Yes. So sometimes we don't know, right? We was able to use this scenario and put that Bruce is a cop, and we just know that he has access to a gun because he's a police officer. Sometimes it's not that apparent in the case, the lethality risk factors. So you want to make sure that you ask those questions. Claudia, has Bruce ever strangled you? Do he have thoughts of suicide? Would you say that the abuse is getting worse? Like, the kids aren't eating, or the kids are hungry. Was that always the case? So there are certain things that you want to ask. In any case that you hear where there's domestic violence presence, you want to make sure that you're talking about the lethality risk factors. And in addition, strangulation is a crime, and it can be extremely harmful to your health. So we want to make sure that we're asking those questions, because we might have to say to a survivor, I think you should seek medical attention, right? Because you don't remember what happened after he strangled you. She probably could have possibly lost consciousness. Okay.
And just another note, that if you are talking to a survivor and they do disclose some of the lethality risk factors, it is 100% okay for you to say, I'm really worried about you. I'm worried about you because I just took this training on domestic violence, and we went through the lethality risk factors, and you have 7 of them.
Yep.
And I'm worried about your safety. If you're feeling that and you're working with someone, it's okay to reflect that back to someone and say, I'm really concerned because it seems like things are getting worse. And we would really encourage you to say, as your next question, to say to the person, what do you want to do next? Or what have you thought about is going to happen in the next couple months? Because most of the survivors we work with have thought through at length what might happen, or what's the worst case scenario, or what they would do if things got worse, or if their children got hurt. And we want to be part of that plan, but we don't want to make the plan for them. right? And if someone says, I don't know what to do, can you help me? That's really different than, and even then we would still say, okay, here are the options. What's the one that makes the most sense for your family? And when we work with survivors, when anyone works with survivors of domestic violence, we work through the empowerment counseling model, which really focuses on looking at what has the survivor already done to keep their family safe, and what do they want to do moving forward to keep their family safe. And maybe we can add in resources or things they didn't know about, but we're not there to make the plan for that person. We might help them write it down. I will probably draw a great picture of it. But besides that, they're there to make the plan, and we're there just to add to it and support it.
Yes.
Okay, so things are a little bit different now. We're still in the middle of coronavirus, even though we all thought it was going to be 2 weeks. And so here we are. And so we really wanted to talk about how things are different right now, and what things have changed. So one of the things that changed is that in the city of Philadelphia, there has been a decrease in people applying for protection orders. And this is not surprising to us, as the process has always been complicated and is now more complicated. That most of the people, if they're applying for a protection order, should request help from the Women Against Abuse Legal Center or another legal center that can help them apply for a protection order right now. The hearings are not in person. They're either on video chat or submitted by email or writing, but the process is different. The actual details on how to apply for a protection order are up on every domestic violence agency's webpage, but the easiest to find is probably Women Against Abuse's legal webpage that we'll put in the chat and send to Yvette too. And then the things that are different also is that, I know you all know this, but increased stress and anxiety increases the potential for violence. It increases the potential for community violence. It increases the potential for family violence, intimate partner violence, domestic violence as well. A lot of people are not getting medical attention. So these are things that are often different, and they're different right now, including children. And part of the reason why is that children are not in school. And so that oversight that school provides is not there. So a lot of you already know, reports to child abuse, to the Department of Human Services or Child Welfare dropped off dramatically around the beginning of COVID. They are back up, but they're not up to where they normally are. And then for those people that do reach out for help, most of the help that they will get is online as opposed to in person. And there is something very different about doing counseling and support groups online as opposed to doing it in person. And right now, a lot of people are even more hesitant to call the police, especially if you're in a certain neighborhood or if you are Black or brown. You are really hesitant right now to call the police. And if you do call the police, the response might not be what you want it to be right now, depending on the experience in your community, in your neighborhood. Some things that have stayed the same are that the isolation is still the same. It's more, but that feeling of being isolated from friends and family is still there. It's still true that leaving doesn't end the abuse. And the cycle of violence we still see happening. And one thing for you all to know is that the hotline is still available 24/7. Counseling is still available, support groups are still available, and the shelter is still available. So Women Against Abuse operates the 2 domestic violence shelters in Philly. It's 200 beds total, 100 in each, for women and children, and families can stay, and men. One of the shelters accepts male survivors as well. And families can stay there for 60 days or 90 days with an extension. Anything I'm forgetting?
Okay. So we all have superpowers, right? We have superpowers in our professional life. We have superpowers in our personal lives, right? But for this work, I really want us to all have the superpower of making a good referral. Making a good referral is extremely important because this is connecting the survivor to the resource, right? And one thing that we don't want to do is just hand the survivor a piece of paper and say, oh, here's the hotline number. If they call, you can call them and get some help. 9 times out of 10, she's going to trash that card or the number. She's not going to call, right? Because we have to remember, we don't know how long she's been in this relationship. We don't know how controlled she is. Again, you might be the first person that she told that she's been abused. So we want to make sure that we tap into that superpower and we make good referrals. So one thing that we want to do is call ahead to the domestic violence agency and give them a heads up that you are going to call with the survivor on the line. Right? You can ask certain questions that you think the survivor may have. You can ask the agency what the intake process look like, what is needed for the phone call and things like that. So you can help prepare the survivor to make those first steps, right? And then what you can also do is give the survivor a space to call, right? You can call with the survivor on the 3-way, because that can be scary, right? Because what you're essentially saying is, and it takes a lot to say this, what you're essentially saying is, hi, my name is Raina. I'm being abused and I would like help.
It's a lot.
That is a lot. That's a lot. And I have children and I'm unemployed and my husband works. I don't have a house, a cell phone. My children are hungry. That's a lot to take to tell someone. So by the time you're making a referral, you already have some kind of relationship with the survivor, because we already talked about those 4 important C's, right? So you want to try and get on the phone with the survivor to make that phone call together, because what that will help her do is help her calm down. It will offer her support. It will say to her, you're not in this alone. I can't pull you out of this relationship, but I can support you in the ways that I can support you. Right? So that's what that's doing. So we just want to make sure that we are using our superpowers and making those good referrals. You can also call the hotline. Like if you don't know what agency would be appropriate for the survivor, because the 4 DV agencies provide completely different services, you can call the domestic violence hotline and ask them the same things, because the people that's operating the domestic violence hotline are the same people that's running the 4 domestic violence agencies. So they can even help you navigate through that. Okay?
So we wanted to tell you what's out there in terms of resources and referrals. First, you should know, as professionals, the hotline is there for you also. So if it's 5 o'clock on a Friday afternoon and maybe your supervisor's left for the day or is at the beach and you need help with a really complicated family where there's domestic violence, you should 100% feel like the domestic violence hotline is a resource to you. It's answered by domestic violence counselors and support people who are in Philadelphia. It's not outsourced to somewhere else as a different hotline. It's only local in Philly. It's answered 24/7 in English and Spanish with language line for other languages. Sometimes they also have someone who speaks Mandarin and Arabic, but you would need to ask. Otherwise, they'll use language line. It's answered by Women Against Abuse, Women in Transition, Lutheran Settlement House, and Congresso. These are probably agencies you know because they provide other services as well. But the hotline is really a great resource. The hotline is also the only way to get someone into a domestic violence shelter. So to get into a domestic violence shelter, you don't go through OHS's intake, the Office of Homeless Services intake, you go through the hotline. It's a separate process. If Raina and I, with all our skills as DV counselors, need to get someone into the shelter, we also call a hotline. It's the way they track all the referrals into the shelter. Legal services for survivors are free, and it's one of the few times that legal services are free. Women Against Abuse handles most of the protection from abuse order help, and also they will take some custody cases, in particular if the family is involved with DHS. So if you have a family who's involved with DHS and needs legal help for protection orders or has domestic violence and is applying for custody, they should definitely tell the legal center that they are involved with DHS, because that doesn't always work to your advantage, but in this case it does. The domestic violence agencies provide court advocacy, and what that means is they will go to court with someone or help them through the process, or can even, right now, since it's all virtual, they can help them, talk them through what that's like. They also provide counseling. Counseling is also free. And it's also provided by the domestic violence agencies. You don't use insurance. And it is a way for people to get really specific, that empowerment counseling, and work on some of their goals and keeping their family safe. The other things are that there's one agency, Women in Transition, that provides substance abuse support. And so they do domestic violence counseling, and then they also do support for survivors who are struggling with an addiction. And you don't have to have gone through a 28-day program to be part of that. We have a couple minutes, like two. So if you do have a question, and Raina, I think you saw some questions. If you
Yes.
do have a question about services, we can answer them now.
So one question was, do women against abuse, was the shelter you mentioned at Women Against Abuse? Yes. Women Against Abuse operate this domestic violence shelter, the 2 domestic violence shelters in the city.
Mm-hmm. And again, those are both accessed through the hotline.
As a social worker, facilitator, et cetera, if I need assistance, I call, yep, you can call the hotline.
Yep.
Yep, it's not just for survivors, it's for family
Mhm.
members, professionals, anyone that have questions. Still not right.
Right. So someone else wrote, like, if you're providing resources for a survivor, to not write a ton of things down that say like domestic violence all over it and then hand it to the person. And one of the things we would do with that is just say, is it okay for you to take these resources with you? And someone might say yes, or you might just offer them on a table and say, if you would like to take any of these resources, you're more than welcome to. But again, it's not something like, even, especially a lot of survivors that we work with, they have their texts and their cell phones are being monitored by their partner.
Mhm.
So it's also not something that we would text someone and say, hey, call Women Against Abuse, here's their number, without first asking, like, is it okay for me to text this to you? Is it okay for me to send this information?
No.
2 minutes. 1. How many shelters are there for women survivors and men? Right. So we did say that, like, men can also be survivors of domestic violence. Women Against Abuse just in January started accepting male survivors as well. It is very rare to have a domestic violence shelter that accepts men as well. Prior to that, the closest one was probably New York City.
Mhm. And really quickly before our time ends, there's 2 agencies, 2 domestic violence agency in the city that provides
Okay, folks, it looks like they're frozen on their side. Their connection is frozen. So let's see. Oh, it's over.